This talk will be a continuation on the first one. I've emailed through all the information for the last presentation to Mikhail, and that you can follow along with that eventually. Today we want to look at several things. We want to look at the effects of the cycles as they're impacting us now. Are you seeing me okay?
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah, okay.
If you want to, we can see and hear you if you're wanting to share your screen. We don't see that.
Yeah, that's what I need to get to. Here we go. Okay, we'll look at the cycles as they're affecting us now. I want to particularly look at the almost coincident transit of Pluto into Aquarius, corresponding with the present start of or ending of the last 250-year cycle, and how that's going to lead us into the multipolar world, with the lessening of influence of the West and the rising influence of the East. And we're going to look at certain statements that were made regarding the end of World War II, which was a major factor in what has emerged and taken place over the last 70-odd years. So I'll start with the share screen, and we can get going here. Okay. Now, why am I not able to?
You're still in edit mode, so if you go to reader view, third icon on the bottom.
Here.
Next one, next to that.
This one.
To the right. Sorry. That one.
Sorry, folks. I've worked in tech all my life, and I'm still not used to this. Here we go. We want to look at what's taking place in the United States, a bit of astrology to start with. And these are the solar arc directions that are in evidence at the moment. Solar arc directions, as the name implied, shows the direction an entity or a person is presently presented with in a particular moment. The one that's affecting us most strongly at the moment in the US is this direction of Mars to the Moon, which rules the 8th house, which is international banking and other people's money. What we're seeing at the moment is great instability in the banking system in the US. It's being kind of whitewashed at the moment, as it would be, because they don't want to panic people. But what we're going to see over the next year is increasing instability with the banking, with the financial sector, and that will lead in another year or so to this direction of Saturn to the US Mars, which indicates a general weakness. Combined with other factors that can be a death direction. I don't see a breakup of the United States, but what I do see is something approaching what DK talked about in terms of the emergence of the US soul, in that it was in for a period of intensive suffering. Fortunately for the soul of the US, he says. Now, how that will manifest is anyone's guess, but we can probably expect that the economy will be pretty well battered, and that's going to affect the world at large. We see various nations moving away from the US dollar. We see inflation on the increase, especially in the West. We don't see it in the East so much. We don't see it in Russia. There are reasons for that, which we'll get to. The other direction we want to look at for the US is Pluto to the midheaven. The midheaven represents the sitting government. And with Pluto on the midheaven in a national chart, it can often indicate coups and that sort of thing, but also a rearrangement of the government. There's been a lot of talk about how the last election was stolen from Trump and all that. But essentially what happened was that they had to have Biden in power to bring about the events that we're seeing today, especially regarding Russia. The reason being that China's rise is greatly troubling the establishment in the US. And they needed to, they thought, to get Russia out of the way so they could go after China. Well, it's not working out so well. So what we'll see over time, over the next year, year and a half, is this direction of Saturn to Mars, which is going to more or less weaken the US internationally. Then we turn to the EU, and we see about a year ago, this direction of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction was on the descendant. And this is when Europe was pulled into line in regards to the conflict in Ukraine, and basically gave away its consciousness, you know. It showed the EU as being a vassal of the US. And essentially what's happened over the past year is the military, or the various militaries in the EU, have been exhausted of their weaponry. And what we're seeing actually in effect is the disarmament of Europe. Now, we might think that that would lead to an arms race, but if you don't have the money to, or the resources to promote that arms race, it's going to leave you pretty well open to, well, all sorts of shenanigans. We'll probably see a lot of fear mongering in Europe regarding Russia, whereas Russia represents a trading partner right on your back door, which is what they've always tried to be since 1991. The other thing we're seeing is this transit of Pluto to the meridian axis, which is going to greatly increase the restiveness within Europe, and will probably bring about quite a bit of change in the governments within the EU. We just saw the Dutch government collapse. We just saw the Prime Minister of Finland ousted. Schultz is not in great shape in Germany. Macron is seeing riots and is being burned in effigy in the streets in France. So we can expect quite a bit of change in the EU as Pluto transits through the first couple of degrees of Aquarius. Moving on to the cycles, these 250-year cycles, as they have, let me get rid of this, as they have occurred in Europe, in relation to Europe. And in our present year, we see our present challenges: the decline of the West, the rise of the East, Pluto in Aquarius from this year, and changes in the world economic financial system. In 1775, let's see, no, this isn't working out. In 1775, how do I get back to the other one? Okay, let's try this again. There we go. In 1775, we had the American Revolutionary War, the First Industrial Revolution, the fall of European monarchies, the rise of modern society. We also saw a lot of revolutions in South America. South America at the time was pretty much colonized by Portugal and Spain. Pluto was in Aquarius from 1778, which was just about the time the American Revolutionary War was winding down. In 1525, we had the Protestant Reformation, the height of Italian Renaissance, the collapse of the authority of the Catholic Church, or the great challenge to it, and the rise of modern Europe. We had the Copernican solar-centric solar system presented, whereas before we thought the universe revolved around us. Pluto was in Aquarius starting from 1532. The reason I'm bringing in Pluto in Aquarius, we'll get to here presently. In 1275, we had the Proto-Renaissance, the height of the Mongol Empire, the first stirrings of European culture. And Pluto was in Aquarius from 1287. I'll be covering the further ramifications of these cycles and Pluto and Aquarius in my upcoming letter, which I hope to have out later tomorrow. But the reason Pluto and Aquarius is brought in is because Aquarius being an air sign and being ruled by Uranus, with Pluto there, it kind of opens a door between the concrete plane, physical reality, and the Buddhic nature, because air represents Buddhi in esoteric astrology. In Orthodox astrology, air represents the mind in general, and we have revolutions in thinking. So if we look at these events, and these are just the very basic events presented on this page, we see that there have been sort of revolutions in thought. Now, what that's going to mean for us going forward, we'll see here in a little bit, but it's going to lead to a general rethink in our world power structure to start with. It'll probably lead to a new economic model. It will lead to new scientific discoveries. And we know that there is a dispensation that's supposed to start in 2025. Now, if we go to post-World War II period and the emerging world order, there were 4 basic references. This is from Externalization of the Hierarchy. First possibility was an all-dominant Russia. It's no longer possible nor desired by Russia. These are my words in brackets. Whose regime would cover the planet, enforcing her totalitarian interpretation of communistic doctrine, so on and so forth. Well, since the Soviet Union collapsed, we know that's not the case, and Russia has reformed and rebuilt itself in many ways. I'm sure Dennis and Svetlana have covered part of this. The second one was a world in which all nations live in an armed armistice. And we kind of had that, you know, it was the Cold War. It was the fear of nuclear annihilation. It would be a world in which distrust is forever rampant, in which science is prostituted to the art of destruction. In this world, an explosion must and will eventually take place, which will destroy humanity, so on and so forth. That's been avoided thus far. And from everything I'm reading, it will be avoided. The third one was a world in which the United States proves itself to be the controlling factor. This is actually what happened. He adds, after wiping out Russia. Well, that was set aside in 1953 when Russia got the bomb, basically, and we had the specter of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It will be a predominantly capitalistic world run by several nations, but headed by the U.S. This has happened, but is currently being broken up due to corrupt practices. A capitalistic nation is not necessarily wrong. Capital has its place, but Russia, the enemy of capitalism, is by no means free from capitalistic bias. And we do see capitalism in Russia. It's not a communist state. It's actually a mixed economy. The motives of the U.S. are very mixed, to put it mildly. Greed of money or its equivalent, such as oil, and at the same time, sincerely good intentions for the establishment of human freedom in a democratic world. Now, pausing there, we say that the U.S. has basically tried to control the world through the institutions set up at the end of World War II, such as the World Trade Organization, the IMF, especially the IMF, the Bretton Woods system, which was abandoned by Nixon in 1971. And from 1971, we've had fiat currencies, which have enabled the U.S. through its control of the financial systems to use sanctions as a weapon against any nation that tries to do away with the capitalistic model of the U.S. We've seen several examples of this, as in Libya, who tried to set up a Pan-African currency separate from the dollar. We see it in China using its yuan and not allowing the U.S. any sort of control in its economy. We see it in Russia, who is reclaiming its sovereignty economically and is starting to trade with the world in its own currency. We saw the destruction of Yugoslavia, which was a socialist country in the bottom of Europe, which was balkanized because it wouldn't play the United States game. There are many, many instances of this, and we've heavily sanctioned Iran for the very same reasons, because they kicked out the Shah, who was a U.S. puppet, and nationalized the oil industry, kicking out BP primarily, British Petroleum. Other motives for the U.S. are an appreciation of the armed fist, and at the same time a longing for economic sharing, for that essential kindness, which is such a strong American characteristic, a mass characteristic. That's important to note, because the average American is rather generous. It's the government, the elites, who try to control everything. And DK had mentioned, I don't have the quote in front of me, about the latent fascism of the United States. This whole system is currently being rethought. Then we have the fourth one, a world divided into blocks for mutual aid and economic sharing. This is what's emerging. Of this, the proposed treaty between Great Britain, France, and the Benelux countries is a tentative example, which eventually became the EU, though it was tainted by objectionable motives. You can read the quote a bit later. The wrong factor comes in when they stand united against any other group or nations, and therefore against any group of human beings. And this attitude, it is this attitude engineered and fostered by Russia, which has led to the relatively new concept of blocks against. Well, Russia is actually rapidly moving away from that against model and looking for win-win cooperation between itself and other nations, despite what we hear in the Western media. Along this line and with this attitude of antagonistic groupings, only disaster can lie. I would posit that the latter two sentences lie in the past and no longer a major concern. It's quickly moderating, but with the US and the UK resisting. So what about these blocks? Well, blocks in themselves can be good and proper if they follow lines of natural cleavages, of language differences, and of cultural distinctions. They can be essentially right if they are formed for economic, educational, religious, and social aims, and can therefore provide no true cause for alarm. This is part of the problem we have with the EU. because the EU, the elites in the EU, have sought to sort of institute the American model of homogenization and ignore the various cultures within the EU itself. Such blocks would be cultural. There's a map on my site. And not militaristic, economic, and not greedy, and they could provide a normal and progressive movement away from separative nationalism of the past and towards a distant creation of the one world and the one humanity. This will someday be seen. Now, this sentence gives us a big clue as to what is supposed to emerge, because he basically states it here without saying it. But the time is not yet. So we're seeing the very beginnings of this now. Mankind is not ready for some super government, nor can it yet provide the unselfish and trained statesmen such as government would require. If we look at our present Western leadership, ambassadors, and so forth, they don't hold a candle to the old civilization states like China, like Iran. Our leadership is much more irrational, as was recently stated to one of the JCPOA functionaries by Alistair Crook. I wrote about this in one of the letters. As yet, there are more seeds of danger in this concept than there are of helpfulness. Nevertheless, it's a dream that will someday materialize after the creation and the functioning of blocks have proved how men or humanity should work and live together. The emerging economic trade blocks deemed advisable are one based in the world democracies, the US, UK, Commonwealth states, and Northern Europe, including Scandinavia and Germany. This would be the Anglo-Saxon bloc. Another one would be based around the Russian Federation, China, and eventually Japan. This is already quickly emerging, along with the rest of Asia and Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe will follow after everything is resolved in Ukraine. And lastly, one based in the Latin and Mediterranean nations, including France and some of the Balkan states in South America. The latter due to the influences of France, Portugal, and Spain. So here we have the British Commonwealth. There are several things of note. Two of the BRICS nations, South Africa here and India here, are in that bloc. And because of the Anglo influence, and because of the inroads China and Russia have made, they're sort of teetering on the edge, as it were, as to whether to stay in the Western Bloc or to look east. My sense is, and this is just speculation, is that they'll form a sort of bridge between the Eastern Bloc and the Anglo-Saxon bloc, speaking in terms of economic blocs. But we see Australia, New Zealand, Canada, several African nations, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, with England as a center. Then we have the Romance-speaking world. This is where Romance languages are spoken. And we notice in Europe we have Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Romania, Moldova, along with almost all of South America, Central America, a large part of Africa, and Canada from its French heritage. That'll be an interesting thing to watch, because French is only spoken in a certain part of Canada. That would be a huge economic and resource block along with that of Asia. Then we have the BRICS and the aspiring members to BRICS, shown in orange. The original members are in red. So we have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Mexico, Argentina. And in fact, Argentina and Brazil are already setting up cross-border payments in their own currencies. And the BRICS members, which I'll also be discussing in the letter to come out tomorrow, are looking at setting up a common BRICS currency. This will evolve rather quickly. So the BRICS basically, or forms the basis of the Eastern Bloc, Eastern Economic Bloc. We notice Japan's not in it right now, but it will be once it throws off the influence of the United States. Korea's not in it, neither of the Koreas. Korea is eventually set to be reunified. Then we start looking a little bit further afield. We have some blocks already in existence, aside from BRICS. We have the Shanghai Security Organization, which was formed by Russia and China. And this is basically a security bloc that is a protective bloc against terrorism. Because terrorism was a big problem in China, and then the Caucasus region of Russia, mostly fomented by the CIA. I've put a lot of reference material for the efforts of the CIA, which Mikhail has posted or will post. There are several observer members, upcoming dialogue partners, and we see that for the most part, Asia is pretty well covered by this security. That also goes toward the economic bloc. We have ASEAN, which is the entirety almost of Southeast Asia. This is already functioning. This will eventually be integrated with the SCO. It's already being integrated with the Belt and Road Initiative. Then we have the greater Eurasian Union, which is a Russian, a Russian initiative. It was formed initially with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Belarus. Belarus is very quickly becoming reunited with Russia as the Union of Nation States. But we also see that there are certain members who are very interested in this. The ones colored in orange. Then we have the G7. Compared to the rest of the world, it doesn't look like much. The United States is by far the biggest economic member. The United States and Canada have almost all the resources. Japan's connected with the US because of the US occupation from World War II. We also have Germany and Italy, who are also occupied by the US, and the UK, who basically performs the function of the American attack dog, if you will. The G7 will gradually be incorporated into these, or be dissolved into these other blocks along cultural lines. Then imagine this. We have the Belt and Road Initiative put forward by Xi Jinping in 2013. Imagine taking a train from London to New York, nonstop. Well, this lies into the future. Once the world militancy has been eradicated or much lessened, much to the point of the passing sixth ray, then these things become possible once nations learn to cooperate again instead of always competing. It's largely the Western nations who want to compete with everybody in terms of dominating people. This is the old Atlantean legacy. But once that is set aside, and I imagine it will be over the next decades, we might see such a railroad emerge with a tunnel. We already have the tunnel across the English Channel, but there could also be a tunnel across the Bering Strait. And then you would start to see roads going down into South America. This will take time, of course, but by the end of this century, I expect, all being well, with the Aquarian age pretty firmly in place, that these things will already be in process. So what we see from all this is a very quickly emerging multipolar world, one that's based in win-win instead of competition, one based in resources instead of fiat currencies, one based in verified trust. That's an important consideration, instead of trust printed on paper. So this pretty much describes what we're headed toward. The United States and the Western powers are very strongly resisting this movement because it threatens primarily the Western hegemony, the US hegemony, and the control over the world's finances. So this control over the world's finances is going to be precipitated, or the collapse of it will be precipitated over these next intervening years as Pluto moves through Aquarius and the world wakes up to the fact that the US is not the sole superpower anymore, that every state has its right to exist and to live freely. We're going to see the elimination of Pax Americana and the evolution of, who knows? It's up to us to decide. So with this, we have about 10 minutes. I'll open it to discussion. There's a lot more we could say. It's a vast, vast subject, of course. And I'll just end by saying that with Pluto transiting through Aquarius, starting in earnest in 2025, we should be ready to be open to any sort of new idea that comes in, ready for new intuitions, not staying stuck in the past, not thinking that what we've had in terms of past teachings are gospel, but taking them as a sort of fruitful basis for movement forward. Because much of what was stated in Destiny of the Nations from Alice Bailey was written for the time, but times and people do change, as do nations. And we see that very strongly with nations like Russia, who've gone through tremendous suffering to arrive at the place where they are. And China as well. China has suffered grievously in the Second World War. Through suffering, the mettle of a nation or a person is tested. And it's said that suffering invokes the soul. So there's much we could say in terms of what lies ahead. The other thing I'll mention is that looking at the rays and the astrology of the various nations, we're going to be given more of that in the coming dispensation, I would say. But we can already start investigating it by looking at the characteristics of nations, their connections with nations across the world, all the connections within Europe, with the United States and abroad, connections like with London and Berlin and China, for instance, through the first ray, France with the third ray in China. it's a very rich field of investigation, and I would greatly encourage it. So with that, we'll open it to discussion and questions. So are there any comments?
Yeah, Malvin, Philip here. What you said occurred to me that the USA could really come into its own soon, being forced back upon itself in terms of its worldly influence, and to look after its own a lot more, in terms of what Kathy mentioned yesterday about the mental health problem in the USA, the crumbling infrastructure, which is extraordinarily bad, and homeless on the streets of just about every city in the States. Excuse me. And excuse me, and many other issues that it's not dealing with now, but is sending billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine or into the military-industrial complex. So this would be a blessing in disguise to have USA's world hegemony lessened and force it back upon itself, and thereby its true sole purpose of Aquarius to emerge.
Well, I would agree, and it's happening very quickly. As I said in the first talk, I'm just back from the US, and I was able to get a good overview of what's happening there, what's happening in Europe. And the people need a big wake up. But what was recently stated by Marco Rubio, he was talking about about Brazil and China setting up cross-border payments in their own currencies. He said within 5 years, if this keeps up, we won't be able to use sanctions as a weapon. Well, what's that going to mean? It's going to take away the last real weapon that the U.S. has to enforce its will on other nations. So that's a very promising development, along with everything else. As to the infrastructure, I can attest to that. Where I was, you can see the decaying infrastructure. And there are many, many videos. You can go to YouTube and find any of a number of videos about the infrastructure in the U.S. and how it's degraded over the years. And I would say it's the same here in Italy too. Other comments?
This is Martha Gallahue actually speaking on Francis Godet's screen. Thank you for this amazing talk. To support some of what you had said, I just wanted to augment a little bit in terms of what we're seeing now. Some of in my basis is this multipolar intercooperative world, and some of the steps that I think will happen even in our lifetime within the next 10 years will be the shifting economic model from a one economy based US money system. We're seeing with these cross-border payments basically are experiments to diversify the current money system, that we actually will have safer economic models when we diversify the economic base from US dollars to yuan to the others that would support what you called blocks. I would suggest we change the term block to call them regions. And that and then I wanted to just share that my background was experience in developing better diplomatic ties within the United Nations. And there are some elements that as we see that particular institution also shift more directly to different diversification of leadership, primarily through people, we will recognize that large groups like ASEAN, BRICS, all of that is deeply integrated into governance systems that I wanted our audience to understand that you're not speaking idealistically exclusively. You're speaking from a pragmatic representation of what already exists, so that I see great hope. I just wanted to add, I think another part of the experimentation that's very important is the breakdown of countries. My home country is the United States, though I live in Canada right now. There's a lot of literature to indicate that the United States itself will break down into 5 or 6 different countries. And if we looked at this idea of multipolar intercooperation, we're aided by the fact that what if we imagined, instead of 212 countries, we imagined 1,000, that because they would not be separative or isolated, they'd be acting within their various regions. So if we take the big thing that you'd said from our Atlantean legacy of dominance to cooperation, we actually are witnessing this happening. BRICS is essentially a cooperating organization, so that if we could let go of our kind of infection of this dominance through arms, we could see better what you're talking about. So thank you very much, and thank you for connecting it to our astrological signs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next.
Kate Hendon has a hand up. Go ahead, Kate.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, Malvin, about something you said at the beginning of the talk when you were talking about the solar arc directions. And you mentioned the disarmament of Europe, not necessarily an arms race. And could you say a little bit more about that? I've been reading or learning about regarding the United States where I live. We're signing off of different nuclear arms disarmament treaties between Russia and the US, and there's the last one coming up for renewal in 2026. And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about the constructive solution to this problem that the United States is creating with Russia and other countries about armament? I hope I made myself clear. I'm not a politician.
Oh, sure. Well, neither am I, but what's happening is the U.S. economy is based in debt. The reason we went off the Bretton Woods system, off the gold standard, was because we had run up so much debt from the Korean and the Vietnam Wars that we couldn't pay our bills. So what Nixon did under direction of the deep state, if you want to call it that, or the Washington establishment, the oligarchs in the U.S., was he pulled the U.S. out of the Bretton Woods system, and basically the Western world had to go on the fiat system. The euro was the result of that eventually. But because of the fiat system, you can do all sorts of manipulation to economies. You know, what we hear about U.S. GDP is essentially false information. The U.S. is in tremendous debt. So what happens when countries stop honoring the U.S. debt? Well, corners have to be cut, and one of the biggest cuts is going to be to the U.S. military. The U.S. military combined is a massive thing. We have something like around 800 bases outside of the U.S. Those would have to be closed. That would be a tremendous disarmament across the world. We wouldn't be able to directly threaten any nation from a U.S. military base.